Hey, what's going on, guys? As promised, I'm coming to you in this video to talk to you about things that I absolutely love about the 737, things that I dislike about it, and likewise things that I absolutely love about the A320 and also dislike about it. It's a common question I get. What do you love about the 73 and the A320? What do you not like about it? Which one do you like better? And if you don't know, I get this question a lot because we actively instruct on both here. Specifically myself, I've been instructing the 737 and the A320 for the last 10 years. I got a little over 4,600 hours of just 737 simulator instruction given in Level D sims. I actively fly the A320 and also have thousands of hours teaching it, and so this is a question that we get a lot. And frankly, I compiled a list of things that I like and dislike. It's two-sided on both airplanes, and I don't even think it's complete because as I was driving in this morning, I had more things come to mind. I'm sure in the days beyond this video that I'm recording right now, I'm gonna have more things come to mind. So I guess what I'm saying is these are some of the main things that come to mind, but I'm sure there's a lot more, and this list would grow probably infinitely, but I got to do a video at some point, right? So I'm going to start with the 7.3. It's the airplane that I started teaching first, and then I'll move on to the A320. And I'm going to share with you first the things that I'm not a fan of on the 737. Okay, the first thing is the overhead panel's old. It's an older overhead panel. It's been the same overhead panel from the days of the 737-200 all the way up till now. The Max, it's basically the same overhead panel. So it's an old overhead panel. I'm not a big fan of that. It's a very manual airplane. You have to manually select the generators on. If you put on the engine start switches to continuous for continuous ignition, that's going to come before the engine anti-ice in case you want to anti-ice the airplane. Maybe you're flying through visible moisture, temperature below 10 degrees, and you want to do engine anti-ice on in flight. You got to turn the igniters on first, then put the engine anti-ice on, and then likewise later on turn off the anti-ice and the ignition. So more manual, more labor intensive. The autopilot. Let's talk about the autopilot for a second. This is probably the least thing that I like about this airplane. I mean, this list, there's several things that I absolutely love and that I don't like. This is probably the biggest thing that I don't like about this plane. It's the autopilot capabilities or lack thereof. It doesn't trim the rudder. And for that reason, it's usually one of the most difficult things in sim training for students is handling the V1 cut. They finally put the autopilot on and then forget that the autopilot does not trim the rudder. So you are manually in control of the rudder even if the autopilot is engaged, and a lot of flight crew will forget that in training. The other thing is the minimum altitude for autopilot engagement. Depending on if you're in a 737 Classic or NG, typically it's about 400 feet, maybe 1,000 feet. The A320 is a little bit lower. It's at 100 feet. It's significantly lower. It's about 100 feet. So the minimum altitude for autopilot engagement is higher, and it's just not as capable because it doesn't trim the rudder, which doesn't necessarily sound like a big deal, but believe me, it is. And that's one of the things I really don't like about this airplane. The autopilot disconnects on a go-around if you're doing a single-channel ILS. Basically what that means is if you have one autopilot engaged, which is most of the time on our Cat 1 ILS approaches, when you hit toga to do a go-around, it disconnects the autopilot, but it leaves the auto throttle engaged. And now the auto throttle is spooling up engines and giving you go-around thrust. Meanwhile, the autopilot is disengaged, and this takes a lot of flight crew by surprise. One, because they get the loud oral autopilot disconnect warning horn that they weren't expecting potentially. And number two, the other thing is that the auto throttle is left on, and on this aircraft, the engines are mounted under the wing, which means thrust application results in a large nose-up pitching tendency. So you have all this thrust coming up and no autopilot. And now you're left there to manually fly the airplane. And by the way, it also even kind of goes a little bit against typically having all automation on or all automation off. Typically we'll say, hey, autopilot off, auto throttle off. Or if you have you don't really want to be half and half. Well, this does leave you half and half. The auto throttle is still on, but the autopilot's off, and you're kind of left to hand fly there. So that's one thing I'm really not a fan of. Again, this is only single channel. If you do a two-channel approach and do a dual channel go around, it'll keep both autopilots on. This seems like a little creature comfort, and it is, but it's quite significant, particularly when you've flown the Airbus. There's nowhere to eat comfortably in the 737. There's no tray table. So you're kind of left to eat in your lap with your legs all crunched up, maybe on the can or the maintenance log or whatever. I mean, you're trying to figure out where there's a flat place to eat with some space. And frankly, it's just not a very comfortable cockpit. It's not as spacious. There's no flat place. There's no tray table. Creature comfort, perhaps, but it's something to consider. Another thing I kind of dislike about the plane, there's no hot start protection. right? No FADEC that will protect you against start anomalies, hot start, hung start, wet start, none of that. You do have an EEC, electronic engine control. If we do experience a hot start on the NG, the EEC will close the fuel valve, but that's after we've exceeded our EGT, and so by that point you've already hot started, but there's nothing that prevents you from hot starting, so it leaves more liability on the pilot. So basically, you got a little bit more liability on starting the engine. Not a fan of that. There's no heading sync. You constantly have to be turning the heading to keep it in front of you all the time. If you're following the magenta line with LNAV and you want to keep heading to course, you want to always keep that heading. There's no button, nothing you can push or pull that quickly syncs your heading to current airplane heading. That's a little bit annoying. There's no automatic engagement when we do a direct to of LNAV. So hey, you're cleared direct JFK VOR. You got to type in direct JFK and push LNAV. Now that's a good thing and that's a bad thing. It's a good thing because if you're just drawing a line or shooting a line, extending the center line, then maybe I don't want to navigate direct to it, right? I'm just shooting a line, and so I don't want LNAV to arm. At the same time, it is an additional keystroke or button stroke that you're going to have to do on the mode control panel on the MCP. When they clear you direct to a point, you got to type it in, then you got to hit LNAV so that it navigates straight there. So adds a little bit of workload. Really, as a whole, I can say this airplane compared to the 320 is just a higher workload, frankly. Don't wear nice watches in the plane because a nice watch usually gets scratched up because the way to adjust the seat is with a manual seat adjustment. Your hand comes right down in between the seat and the center pedestal, and too many times you'll end up nicking the front of your nice watch. So if you got a Rolex or a Breitling or something, I probably wouldn't be wearing it to fly. At least not if you wear your watch on your left hand and you're a first officer, so you're gonna have to reach down in the middle there. You'll probably screw it up. If you're a captain in your left hand and you gotta adjust seat from the right hand, whatever, no big deal. Or even if you're an FO and you're gonna wear your watch on the right hand. But basically, I would be careful about wearing nice watches because I have scuffed up quite a few, frankly. The navigation display, let's talk about the navigation display for a minute. This is kind of a big deal. There's no DME rings, at least not in the sims and in the airplane that I have flown, that shows distance. There has been lines, there's a line on the navigation display that shows distance to the next waypoint, but there's not a nice arc that shows, hey, 20 miles away, 40 miles away, 60 miles away, and that's really important for my energy management and descent planning and deceleration. So for the purpose of energy management, I like to have those rings on the navigation display, and unfortunately, it just doesn't have it. There are some good things about the nav display, which I'll talk about in just a second here when we get into the good things about it. The altitude preset, when they say climb and maintain or descend and maintain, whether it's a climb or a descent, the altitude that you're going to is always shown on the top of the altimeter instead of on the bottom of the altimeter. It's preferable to have it shown on the bottom of the altimeter if we're descending and on the top of the altimeter if we're climbing. This way I can always see if we're going up or down to that altitude, and unfortunately the presentation just isn't as ergonomic. Sometimes the reversers, people have issues deploying the reversers on landing, and the reason they have issues deploying the reversers on landing is because there are mechanical locks that prevent the reversers from being actuated if the thrust levers are not totally at idle. So unless those reversers are hitting idle, totally at idle, and you try to go into reverse, there it will allow you to. Sometimes what happens is when these pilots grab the reversers, it's kind of an unconscious thing, but there's a little bit of a pulling action on them that brings the thrust levers off of the idle position by just a little bit. I'm talking centimeters. And when you pull it off of the idle stop, so to speak, just by that little bit, all of a sudden the reversers are locked. So it has happened where I'm flying seat support for a student, they're in the captain's seat, they're trying to get into reverse, they can't get into reverse, and I'll go in there and hold the thrust levers at idle for them while they go into reverse because they're fighting with it, trying to figure out why isn't it coming out. And of course the reason it's not coming out is because it's locked mechanically if the thrust levers are not all the way back at idle, and sometimes that happens. There's no ram air turbine. I would prefer for the airplane to have a ram air turbine. It doesn't have it. And finally, the PTU is not quite as capable, or the power transfer unit is not as capable as the A320, simply because the power transfer unit on the 737 is only really good for leading edge devices and auto slats, whereas on an A320 you can power the entire yellow or green system depending upon which one it's supplying pressure to. So quite a list of dislikes. There's likely a ton more that I'll think of. But these are the things that I'm not a fan of on the 737, specifically on the NG I'm talking here. But with that, let's share some things that I absolutely love about the airplane. On the 737, I definitely love the capability of LNAV and VNAV, particularly the VNAV capability. The descent planning is better than the A320 in my opinion. And also we can utilize VNAV for the purposes of a localizer approach. We can use VNAV for a localizer approach, and that's really, really nice because the 320 can't, and you're left to typically descend down in either vertical speed or usually FPA. So VNAV capability is great. The auto throttles actually move in the 737. I really like that. The navigation display has a very tight range. When I zoom in the navigation display, it zooms in really, really tight. There's no wasted space on the nav display. So when I drop down to the lowest range on the nav display, perhaps I'm doing a circling approach as an example, I can really see where that runway I'm circling to is on the navigation display, and it aids greatly in situational awareness when I can get in that tight on the navigation display. Really, really like that. Here's one of the things that I could tell you is probably one of the items that makes this airplane, just in terms of handling emergencies, it could be a little bit easier than perhaps the 320. Handling emergencies generally in the 737 in terms of actually complying with procedures and protocols is easier. There's no ECAM action to screw up. It's basically have a problem, go to the QRH. And I love that simplicity factor of the 737 and really any Boeing. Have an issue, go to a QRH. Problem, quick reference handbook, always. 320 is a bit different. I'm going to share with you here just a little bit later in the video, but I really like how they structured the QRH utilization. The mode control panel knobs are different. The knobs on the MCP for speed, heading, and altitude are all different. So even if it's nighttime or low visibility, perhaps smoke in the cockpit, who knows, just by reaching to it, you can really feel if I'm on a speed knob, a heading knob, or an altitude knob, and that's a very ergonomic design. Really like that. The brakes don't heat up on the airplane. There's not, well, they heat up, but they're not as problematic as the A320. A320 is really a problem child when it comes to brakes. That's why we have the brake fans. It's not uncommon to have a brake hot ECAM appear after a landing, particularly at an airport that's maybe not sea level, or even if it is and it's a hot day, it's really not as big of an issue on a 7.3 to have a brakes issue. So love that. I also like the manual reversion function on the 7.3. You can lose your hydraulic system A, you can lose system B, and you're gonna have that manual reversion cable and pulley system just like you would on a Cessna 172. And I really, really like that about the 737. That's not common to the 320, right? So with that, lots of things I like about it, lots of things I dislike about it, and again, this is kind of a pilot / instructor perspective, having taught it for quite some time, flown it, and the list really is not complete because I'm sure when we turn this camera off, there's a lot more things that will come to mind, but just to give you an overview of some things that I have off the top of my head that I was able to write down, that would be it. Let's move to the 320 now. I'm going to share the dislikes with you and then I'll share the likes. On the 320, something I really dislike is there's no auto thrust movement. The thrust levers do not move. I really don't like that. I always kind of joke and say, you know, they were able to put an electric motor in the chair and the seats because the seats move electrically, which I do like, but the thrust levers don't move. And then of course, Boeing is the opposite. The seats do not move electrically. You have to manually move them and mess up your watch, right? But the auto throttle does move. So, you know, where they did put that motor in, something I joke about, but I do like the fact on the 7.3 that it moves, not so much on the 320. The navigation display has a very poor zoom range on the 320. It doesn't zoom in as close, so circling approaches when we're teaching those are sometimes a little bit more difficult to have the full picture situational awareness top-down view as close in as we would on a 7.3. So I don't like the zoom range of the nav display. It does not get close enough, even on a straight-in approach. You'll notice that the runway is this little thing on the display, and then there's this big section of the display that's just black space wasted. I would have liked to see that runway fill up more of the screen. Handling emergencies. Let's talk about this for a minute, because frankly, this is probably one of the things that I dislike the most about this airplane. Handling emergencies in an A320 is just more cumbersome. They have an ECAM, which basically stands for Electronic Centralized Aircraft Monitoring. It's a checklist that pops up. It's very intuitive, and that's great, but there's two issues with the ECAM. One is it doesn't think, it just spits out according to a level of priority. Level 1, 2, or 3, an engine fire being the highest priority, number 3, and then maybe an engine failure being a number 2. So because of this prioritization of ECAM emergencies, it's a common thing that I'll do in sim training, just for the purposes of training, not checking or tricking anybody, but I just want to demo how the ECAM doesn't think to the students, and what I'll do is give them an engine failure and a fire at the same time. Engine failure number 1, engine fire number 2, the ECAM tells us the fire issue first because it's a higher level priority. The ECAM action directs to shut down the engine. Meanwhile, you still have engine 1 failed, and you may not have realized that. So depending upon, you know, your skill level. So I guess what I'm saying is think about what you're doing. Now, once the ECAM is complete, we get to the status page. That's the second thing, the protocol, the verbiage. A lot of people screw this up, what to say, when to say it, how to say it. That's something we cover a lot in training as well. So the ECAM it's just levels of priority, it doesn't think, and there's a lot of verbiage and protocol to go through to get it sounding crispy, right? So once we get to the status page, we stop ECAM, we consider any pending checklist, maybe the after takeoff, and then we have to think about any OEBs, right? Any operating engineering bulletins. These bulletins cover items that were not included on the ECAM screen originally, and the manufacturer put it out later. And then once we consider those relights, computer resets, we have a computer reset table that we can refer to. Finally, we get that done, the ECAM action is complete, then we reference the QRH. So I guess what I'm saying is it's a web of go here, go there, try this, try that, and make sure we check all these boxes. So it's more cumbersome to handle an emergency really in a 320. The descent planning. Not as good because it doesn't actively update your idle path. It only gives us one idle descent path, and the rest is what we refer to as geometric, meaning it's constantly having to adjust thrust and add thrust. So I talk more about that in the A320 online program and energy management, but basically I like the 737 descent planning a little bit better than the 320. You can make it work with some tricks, but overall I like the 7.3 setup on that a little bit better. The FCU knobs, the flight control unit, also known as the MCP or the mode control panel in the 7.3, they're pretty much all the same, so it's a lot easier to confuse. It's not uncommon to see somebody grab a speed knob when they meant to grab a heading, or grab a heading when they meant to grab a speed. So I like the fact that Boeing differentiated the knobs to feel, the look, the texture, so that you don't actually have to look at each one. The brakes, big issue on the A320. They heat up a lot, and that's why they got brake fans installed, but 7.3 doesn't have that problem. And the other thing I don't like about the 320s, there's no manual reversion. You have hydraulic systems and you have plenty of them, right? You got your green, yellow, and your blue, but if you lose all three, you're a lawn dart. There is no manual reversion, and unfortunately, therefore, no way to control the airplane via the flight control. So I do like the 7.3 manual reversion aspect better than the 320 not having one. Let's talk about some things I do like about the 320. Number one, it's spacious, it's comfortable, it's quiet. It's got a tray table. It is overall a more comfortable cockpit to fly in. The autopilot, this is probably one of the highlight of the plane for me. Something that I absolutely love about the A320. The autopilot is triple axis. It's 3-axis. It can control pitch, roll, and yaw. It's also a minimum autopilot engagement altitude of 100 feet. So when we're training B1 cuts, it's a lot simpler for students to grasp the concept, and they don't have to worry about adding or reducing rudder input with varying airspeed and thrust, right? So, love that aspect about the airplane. We have a secondary flight plan function, which is great. I know some Boeings do have that as well now, but it came standard in the A320 since the 80s, and I really like that, the fact that they had that technology back then. I talked about the nav display having not only the range that I disliked it. I didn't like the fact that it did not give us a tight range, but something I do like about it is it gives us the DME rings. So we have these rings that basically show us where, depending upon what range we have selected, where 20 miles is, where 40, where 60, where 80 miles is, and greater depending upon the range. And I really like that for energy planning and descent planning, more so on the A320 than in the 7.3. It's got a ram air turbine. Love the ram air turbine. Gives us hydraulic and electrical power. The power transfer unit, or the PTU, is a lot more capable in the A320. The yellow system can power the green, and vice versa. The green can power the yellow and everything associated on it, as opposed to the 7.3, where all we really get from the PTU is leading edge devices and auto slats. So the 320 PTU, far more capable. Also, the heading syncs automatically in the A320, and when we go direct to a point, nav mode, LNAV, basically engages automatically, so it's a little bit less workload. Overall, the A320 is less workload. Unless there's an emergency to handle, then we have more workload, right? So what can I tell you about the 7.3 or the A320? They're both great planes. They're both very popular in the aviation market. As far as which type rating I would recommend, it really depends on where you're trying to fly geographically, what part of the world. I would maybe reach out to us and I would give you my guidance personally for your particular scenario, but you really cannot go wrong with either one. I genuinely love the A320. I like flying it. It's very comfortable. It's a great airplane. And also, I love teaching the 737 and loved flying it. What I would tell you is the 737 is easier to teach and also easier to learn, but it is a little bit more difficult to fly because it doesn't have auto trim, something I love about the 320. It trims automatically in the pitch axis. the 737 does not trim automatically in the pitch axis. So therefore, it also does not trim with the autopilot on for the rudder. So it's a little bit more labor intensive and a little bit more manual. So it's a pilot's airplane, so to speak, and that can bring a little bit of challenges dependent upon your skill level and experience level and training. So 737, easier to learn, a little bit more difficult to fly. A320 is a little bit more difficult to learn just because there's a lot of things like flight control laws that are maybe not so tangible, not relatable to previous experience that you may have. So not as easy to necessarily learn or even teach, but it is easier to fly because it does a lot more things automatically for you. Both great jets, love them both. I could not be happier to say that I teach both of them, but overall I would tell you the A320 is a great plane to fly. It's very comfortable, very quiet, very spacious. The 737 is a great airplane to teach. All right. Hope to see you guys. Comment below, subscribe to the channel, like this video and others. We'd love to hear your feedback. If you're in Miami, please stop by. And just so you know, these books that you see here, this is a Type Rating Playbook to Success, a 60-page easy read book that I wrote, and also have a video and audio program that accompanies. You can grab that at onestepprep.com/playbook. And if you don't know, I'm also very big into personal development, leadership, communication, financial instruction, that kind of thing. I have an additional book that I wrote. This one's 235 pages long. It's 80 lessons. And you can grab this one at munozmission.com/book, where I'm on a mission to help you get on your mission. All right, so these are the two books. I actually have a third one in the process right now. That'll be coming out soon, that has everything to do with instruction for the AX3 certification system. That basically is my trademark system on how to deliver high quality, effective instruction. So I very much look forward to meeting you here in Miami. If you're in Miami, please stop by. I'd love nothing more than to shake your hand, have a cup of coffee with you, talk airplanes or talk life, whatever you'd like to talk, and just get to know you a little bit better. All right, we'll see you here. Joe Munoz, the name, onestepprep.com. We'll see you in another video.